Thank you everybody for coming along to our panel discussion today about the Amazon TV series. This was sort of my idea about 2 years ago, and obviously a lot has developed in that period of time. And so I thought it would be good for us to sort of just have a bit of a chat about what could be happening and perhaps what we might like to be happening. So just to quickly run through who's on the panel with me. On my right I have Brian Sibley. Brian Sibley will be well known to all of you, aside from his collection of books tying with the film series, but for working on the adaptation of the BBC radio series in the early 80s.
Yeah.
On my right. On my immediate right I have Dimitra Fimi, a well-known Tolkien scholar who most recently worked on A Secret Vice. To my immediate left I have Anke Eißmann, who is a Tolkien artist, so is well versed in how to turn Tolkien's words into visuals. Next to Anke we have Jeremy Edmonds. Jeremy, like me, when Amazon started releasing pictures of the maps online, I think it was Jeremy and I were the ones that were sort of deconstructing them the most between the two of us and sort of picking out what was actually going on here. And Jeremy runs the Tolkien Guide website, don't you? So there's and then on my far left, I have Marcel. Marcel is a former president of the German Tolkien Society and is well known to everybody as the Tolkienist. So what we know about the Amazon TV series so far, what we publicly know so far, is they have confirmed that we will be starting in the Second Age. We know this for a fact. They have tweeted it, so it must be true. We also know that they have signed a deal for 5 seasons, and they've also said on record that the production will begin in 2020, and we would expect a release in 2021. So I'm going to start with Marcel on the far right, but please do contradict each other and have a nice row. But Marcel, why?
You mean why do you have the series, or what?
Why are Amazon choosing to do this? Why? You know, the Lord of the Rings films were a fantastic success. Lots of people said these things couldn't be beaten. Why have they chosen to do this and invest so much money into it? You know, we're talking a sum of about $1 billion in terms of buying the rights and then the production costs. This is a lot of money.
For those of you who may have been to the New York Tolkien exhibition, Jeff Bezos, the owner and CEO of Amazon, was at the exhibition, and it felt a little bit like, I invested $1 billion. I'd better have a look at this. and what you just said is, I think, the main reason. It's one of the best. We should now realize that Tolkien is a brand name, and it's the best thing right now you can have after a certain series that what I'd like not to name, which was fantasy and very successful. So you need another.
So would you agree with that? I mean, do you think this is just about finding the next Game of Thrones?
That's not my words, Shaun. It's just not my words.
No, I think there's just a realization by a younger generation of readers and scholars that there's just so much more there than we've seen before, and that the Lord of the Rings is just the tip of the iceberg. I don't need to tell people in this room that. But the outside world is getting the message. I think there is much more that is, there are multiple versions of things, there are stories that have been told, there are amazing stories that are hidden there in the Second Age that could do very, very well. And yet, of course, the industry is going to look at untapped stories. That's what they do. They look at content is the word that is used. But this is something that has a recognition. I mean, brand, I don't like the word brand as a critic and as a scholar, but it is what it is, and we've come to where we've come. There is also a risk aversion element, I think, to the industry of using tried and tested material that they know will work. And when you have a dedicated fandom like Tolkien has, it sounds like a winner situation.
So you think it really is just the fact that this is a bankable franchise, as it were, and they have stories that they know they can tap
and they know there is so much more that could be developed, especially, you know, I mean, Tolkien himself talks in that famous letter to Milton Baldwin about leaving something sketched and not quite told in detail, and that vast canvas. There is so much potential.
Okay, and Jeremy, Dimitra says there is so much potential. What would you do if you were doing an Amazon TV series?
Well,
That shouldn't have come out.
That was quite delayed, Marcel.
I'm very excited about the second age. I think from a connection to the Lord of the Rings, which was important to them, they've named it the Lord of the Rings on Prime. Intentionally, that's one of the few facts that we've gotten out of them of what they want to work on. But the second age, with the preparatory material and the characters and the elves and the Númenóreans that are leading up to it, I think are particularly interesting to me. I think it's a great story that is well encapsulated and has enough episodic nature to it. There's enough linear story that they can get 5 seasons out of it and not be taking a slim book and making a 9-hour movie out of it.
So, as you mentioned, it's called The Lord of the Rings. Do you think that is just a brand name to tie into what everybody is familiar with? Or do you think, because you mentioned the Númenóreans there, so, and this will, I'll open this up to everybody else, so do consider your answers. How much do you think they're going to focus on Númenóreans? And how much do you think they're going to be focusing on Sauron, the Ring, elves, Last Life, all of that aspect of things, as opposed to what's happening in Númenor?
So, I think they're not decided yet. I certainly would feel that telling all of those stories and interconnecting them across, you know, for example, taking one or two of them, the Númenóreans and the settling down and going exploring Middle-earth and discovering it and creating some of the first cities and finding the elves settled there, would make a great first season sort of introduce, and then roll into maybe season 5 is going to be, you know, the last battle and the rings and everything is. I feel that that is the way they're leaning, just on what they're.
Because the presumption is that they are delving into the appendices very heavily.
Sure.
Do you think with the 5 series, those 5 series will span just the second age, or will they say get up to the point of where Lord of the Rings begins? How far forward do you think they would go with this? Would they seek to tie it into the films at the end, or would they seek to go further and potentially do the Lord of the Rings story as a follow-on season? Because one thing we also know, which I've mentioned, is they have also signed a partner agreement to a spin-off series as well, haven't they?
Yes.
We have no idea what that actually looks like, as things currently stand. Do you think they would attempt to go the whole, all the way through to the third age or not?
I think the primary arc that they're considering, without any prior knowledge, but just looking at what they're publicizing so far, is really up to the end of the second age. That they want to lay the foundation and let people who haven't read the books, and we've got an entire generation of people who've grown up on the movies and are just discovering the books and the other materials out there. So lay that foundation, introduce everyone to the core characters that started the battles that ended up finishing in The Lord of the Rings. I don't think that we're going to see The Lord of the Rings redone in season 4 or 5 or as a spin-off. I think they're happy with the movies and they want to tell the stories that are laying around. And I think the primary goal of the 5 season is the lead up to that. So it will kind of taper off to where the movies would start, and a spin-off might do, you know, some things we've seen some fan films done on, like, you know, The Search for Gollum, or similar topics like that. Might be some other topics that they can tie more closely to the movies.
So you mentioned about fans. Do we think, perhaps this is a question for Brian, do you think that actually it will be a challenge for them when Amazon have produced the first series, and perhaps, let's for argument's sake, say they're in Eregion and the elves have crafted the rings, do you think fans will struggle with that this is not the Lord of the Rings they are familiar with? Even though, branded Lord of the Rings, this isn't actually that story.
I think what's really fascinating, the way in the last 20 years, that the Lord of the Rings has gone through so many transformations. There was a time when it was the kind of sacrosanct text. And whatever you think of, say, Ralph Bakshi's film version, whatever you think of my radio version, they kind of follow. No. Thank you, Dennis. Always plant your friends. But whatever you think of those things and their shortcomings and the things they cut out and maybe in places the things they put in, the moment that the Jackson machine started, the product, the brand, the franchise suddenly became something different. It became something which incorporates the book and it incorporates the imagination of lots of other people, which sometimes follows the book and sometimes goes off. And I mean, I've looked in the appendices just to check to see if I could find Toriel and anything of her early history, but I can't. But so you see what I mean? It's now, it seems to me, it's kind of open season, and in some ways I think that's fine, because my experience of working in connection with the films has been that there's a huge number of people, I don't know if it's still the case, I suspect it is, who have still never read the book, but for them, they have a core understanding of the book's story through the films. And I don't have a problem with that, because I'd rather people have some sense of understanding what Tolkien created, even if it's not the thing itself. But what this begs, the question this begs is, and I disagree actually, I really do think with whoever it was that said it, that I really do believe this is actually a very, very conscious, determined step to say, let's not bother to worry whether people know the difference between J.R.R. Martin and George R.R. Tolkien. I really think it's just, this is a bandwagon that rolled and ran, and let's face it, outran the books. The books are still there now. George Martin is now a hostage to fortune to have to deliver what somebody else has already reinterpreted before he's finished writing it. So that's the truth. And I think, but what I do think, trying to be positive, is that in how many is it? 3, 4, 4, 1 years of history of the Second Age, there's a heck of a lot of good stuff here. And since this book is not, as we all know, a trilogy, but a book that was one book that was divided into 3. I don't know that Tolkien would be too fussed if the Second Age was described as being part of the Lord of the Rings, because it is, in part of it at least, a good part of it, is about the essence of the rise of the Lord of Sauron. The only problem I think people will have is that Sauron is practically nothing other than, I know there's a few shots of him in the film, but basically it's just that eye at the top of the tower. So I think having to give that a real identity is going to be a big challenge. But I think people just will buy into it, absolutely.
And just coming back to this, the title, right? The Lord of the Rings, and whether we're going to go into the story of the Lord of the Rings. Well, Sauron is the Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely.
I don't see any contradiction here between telling the story of Sauron and keeping the Lord of the Rings as the title of the show.
So does that mean then that actually the first half of the Second Age, where Sauron is essentially absent, are we not going to be seeing that? Because that's the story basically of Numenor, isn't it?
It depends on how much you can frame that as flashbacks or background, or there are techniques to do those sorts of things. And if I can quickly interject on this idea of adaptation as we tend to think about the word adaptation as something negative, something that's going to necessarily be inferior to the original. Adaptation theory has been around for a long, long time, and adaptation in critical studies is a very neutral term. It's just a thing that happens. And actually, it has been happening for centuries and millennia. In many ways, folklore is adaptation, myth, and how it is transmitted from generation to generation, from place to place, and how stories travel. There's nothing new about all of this.
And every illustrator.
Exactly, every illustrator, every different medium, all of this has been going on for a long, long time with many, many other texts. There's nothing ab initio problematic with that. And in some ways, you could think about adaptation also as an evolutionary term. things adapt to survive, or again, this is not my theory, this has been discussed, again, as I said, for decades. So adaptation could be seen as something that changes a text to let it speak in different ways, in different contexts, which is a completely normal process.
So Anke, Brian Sibley says that it's open season and Tolkien wouldn't be fast. What do you think?
I can't speak for
Can I rephrase that?
I can't
read words, Brian.
I can only tell my reaction when I heard about the planned series. My first thought was, oh no, not again. Because that's no secret, I'm not a big fan of the Peter Jackson films. Mostly because of the way the story was adapted, not the art direction, not the creative talent behind making. I like watching the making ofs actually. I don't like watching the actual films. And then once it had settled, the first shock had settled, I thought actually it might be quite a good idea to have an alternative audio-visual version from the Jackson films, just a different thing, even if they might use some of the same creative team, or it may look similar, which I think it will in a way, because again the series which shall not be named has taken that up, and I think there's a certain aesthetic to these things. I would love to see something more daring maybe in terms of how it's filmed, how it's edited, how the story is constructed, and the second age, because there's so much in there, there's such a, there are so many years to cover, and you have immortal characters and you have mortal characters, so somehow you have to mix these two, and you can't just, I think you can't just stick to the immortal characters, but if you have the mortal characters in there, how do you do that? You can't just introduce new characters every episode, because the others have died off, because if you had time to 100 or 200 or whatever years, I mean with the Numenorians a little bit longer, but still you have to have some consistency and something for the viewers to identify with. So yeah, I think there are many chances, there are also many pitfalls, so yeah.
So, could I just ask something? I think there are quite a few underlying assumptions that we're making on the Amazon series, judging from the film trilogies, from the series that shall not be named, both in how it's being told, how it looks like. But I would love to see something, completely different. There are hints that are going for an aesthetic which is similar, because it's a franchise and you don't want to turn people away.
And the rumour is that they're going to go to New Zealand again, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But the thing is, how awesome would it be? And then the film, the age thing wouldn't really happen if it's like a Versailles version, the French series about just 15 years, like a court of Sauron and Numenor, and all the love triangles and the power triangles, and how they deal it, and how our Farazon is going about, and then you just need these 10 years, and every room in Numenor can be used. It's just fantastic. Or Fast and the Furious. And magic, information being transported about Middle-earth, from the elves to men to everything. Just go bloody nuts. The story is fantastic. It's just the way we're sort of assuming that it's just going to be fantasy all the same. So something different.
What about a sitcom or...
Season 4.
The Faithful.
When they're just getting back together.
But I think, I agree with the visual canon of what Anke was saying, that it would be really nice for them to challenge the visual canon that has been now sort of fossilized in some ways in a generation of readers and viewers, and to do something completely iconoclastic but yeah, I mean, we haven't seen anything yet. We shouldn't give up.
We have seen maps.
We've seen maps, but these are Tolkien-based maps.
I have some complaints there, but...
Yeah. just because both Jeremy and I have issues with the maps, so there's various things that are not quite...
They try.
They did try.
But I would be surprised for a company like Amazon to invest all this money and not make an artistic statement at the same time. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I guess it would be a bit lazy if they do make it look exactly the same as all the things, even if they have got John Howe going to New Zealand again. But Marcel, you mentioned Versailles and the court of King Louis. I have wondered this, and some people in the audience know that I was going to ask this question, so you've now given me the opportunity to ask it. Anatar is described as being fair to the elves. Will we see a sexy Sauron?
Seriously? I knew I'd be asked that question, I just didn't know who would ask me this. Thanks, Shaun.
He's trying to audition.
It's... yeah, right. My glasses give me away. Right. No, I think they will definitely go for sexy Sauron. Very much so. Because the aesthetic needs to have... I mean, imagine there are elves running around. And they're usually not of the ugly kind of, you know, looks. So if you want to have Sauron, the charmer, you know, the person who gives gifts and advice and is wonderful and lovely and everything, you know, there has to be someone, you look at him and he's the center of the room. You turn around, you look to him, you ask him, and you want his attention. Just like Lucas Dells did. So, and it's, I hope it's not gonna be Benedict Cumberbatch. Yeah, I know you don't, Jason.
So, you mentioned that the challenge is about time, essentially, of the ages. And I guess this is a question for you, Brian. What do you think are going to be their other challenges when they're adapting this? You know, bringing it all together, what are they going to struggle with?
Well, what they've got to start with, of course, is, apart from a lot of bits of information, is they've got huge freedom, and that, in a sense, is something which I really am envious of, because, I mean, they can either use that wisely or they can use it badly, but they do have the freedom to take a whole series of key events and develop them in the way that they want to, and depict them how they want to. I'd like to think that they would, as has been said, do that really imaginatively and evocatively and different. My fear is that it might go the route of put an arrow in his gob and nobody tosses a dwarf. You know, I'd hate to see that kind of coarsening of the material. But it's a big challenge for the writers, because they've somehow got to emulate the style, because we know the style from Unfinished Tales and all the other writings we know, and the book itself. So we have a style, and they have to emulate that, but at the same time they have to invent so much. You know, they've got to give characterizations. Everything I've dramatised, one of the hardest tasks I've ever found in anything I've dramatised is the challenge of filling out those characters which the author never quite bothered to tell you about. You know, and there's, in the Lord of the Rings, particularly, you do have marginal characters, and you have to try and give the actor and the creative people involved some reason for how that character acts and looks and so on. And visually, of course, you've got to do the same here, because you've got very little to go on. So I see them as having great opportunity, but potentially quite challenged. And they have to put together a group of writers. I mean, I saw the writers are listed on the promotional video. But those writers have really got to deliver. They've got to get inside the skin of Tolkien's imagination. And what I've always tried to do, whether it's Mervyn Peake or C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or T.H. White or any of the other, Richard Adams, the other books that I've dramatised, I've always tried to find a way of thinking like the writer, so that even, I remember being called over the hauled over the coals, whatever that was, whatever that, I'm tired of it, we've been driving for hours. But anyway, I remember being hauled over the coals for putting in a scene from Unfinished Tales about Gollum being stopped at the border. You know, it's very early in the first episode of Gollum being interrogated. And people say, well, it's not in Lord of the Rings. Well, it's in there, it's in the appendices, and it's referred to. And I think that the difficulty you have to do is to get inside what that imagination of that writer is, to try and think like them. I'm sure they would try and do that. It's a big ask, because you've got a big team of people who are going to be working with a lot of pressure because of the money. The money is going to call the shots. You know, the film series we're not supposed to talk about, if you look at that and you compare it with Martin's writing, if you look at that, you see how things are sexed up and things are made more titillating, or you know, it's a choice, you like it or you don't like it, but you know, there's going to be pressure because the money's big. People are going to want a lot of schlock horror, they're going to want a lot of violence, they want a lot of the fantasy brought up to the highest kind of level, and they're going to want, you know, titillation, because that's what that franchise has now become. And you know, whatever you say about Jackson, and there's a lot of things negative that can be said about Jackson. Later. But whatever you can say about Jackson, because he was aiming for an audience which was a very specific audience, he couldn't go to the lengths which other shows are going to in their level of violence or excess, whatever that excess may be, maybe sex or violent excess. He kept it within a constraint. And that was again because of the money, because the people who were backing those films wanted the maximum amount of income that they could get from it. So they didn't want the film to be pushed into a category which was going to alienate people and not get bums on seats. Here, you've got a completely different situation, because people are consuming this product at home. They're not constrained by the cinema regulations. They've got freedom to do whatever they want. So with that freedom comes great responsibility, is I suppose what I'm saying.
So Brian says that the challenge and the opportunity are the same thing in that way.
Why do you keep saying Brian?
That's the next t-shirt slogan.
Yeah. Jeremy, what do you think?
So, I think I've got two things I think that make me hopeful about this from Amazon in particular and the team that they've announced, just to add some positivity to the conversation and some hope here is, I think they did an excellent job, a different creative team, but under the same executive side with Good Omens and The Two Immortals, and they only had 6 episodes, but I think if they had been given 5 seasons, there were a lot of stories that they intentionally cut out, and I think that same sort of architecture, when we've got Galadriel and Anatar, you know, not together, but the Two Immortals on 2
They're
sides.
together now.
No. Hopefully.
That's how rumors have started.
I think they've got some characters that are well known and are on opposite sides at the end, but not necessarily at the beginning. And they can use those as linchpins to have other stories be told around them coming through. So I think they've proven in architecture it's been successful in that show. So I have hope that they can do it again. And then, you know, I think Breaking Bad is another example. They've actually got some of the creative writing team from there, and that was another very successful show about a protagonist who went bad. I mean, that's the point of the show. And if they start in that regard with someone who seems like a good character and it slowly progresses over 5 seasons to become clear what he really is, you know, underneath the fair skin or the sexy appearance. So
why are you pointing at me?
So I have hope. I have there's enough creativity in the team that they've pulled together. There's enough material for them to work with. I think that they have enough gaps in the story for them to have their own creativity shown. I know Tolkien was very much against tinkering, as he said it. Like, there's a quote, I'll remember it exactly tomorrow, but I'll paraphrase here, but he said, you know, I love that everybody appreciates my story and loves it, but I wish they'd stop tinkering with it. It was one of the letters he wrote about the Zimmerman script.
But that's ambiguous, because he also, as you were saying earlier, he also talked about it being a work to which other people could contribute.
Absolutely, yes.
So he himself was, I don't know, I can understand it. You know, you create something, you think,
It's your baby.
wouldn't it be lovely? You know, people can add to it, but then when they do, hang on, what are you doing? So, you know, I think he slightly wanted it both ways.
I absolutely
think most creators do. I think
Yeah,
it's a
I
completely normal
agree.
thing.
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
I mean, I'm hopeful. Are we filming this? Okay. I will not answer any specific questions on this, but I was involved in a rival bid, which didn't get it, clearly Amazon did. So I've seen ideas that others have proposed for the series, and there were some brilliant ideas there. So I'm very hopeful for what else has been presented, which won this bid. That's all I'm saying here.
Okay. So actually, I think there's a lot of optimism on the panel actually about their potential, but also similarly a little bit of concern about where this could head. I guess one of the questions, I'll start with you, Anke, on this one. What do we think fans are going to want to see? What is it? You know, when Amazon start releasing these, what is it they're going to want from this?
I think that's as diverse as fandom is. I mean, there are people who want something very close to the books they like. There are some who want another Peter Jackson-like adaptation. There are some who might want something like fantasy shows that have been successful. I don't think you can answer it.
Okay. So
I don't think I can even answer it for myself. I know what I like or dislike about certain adaptations. For example, I very much like the Good Omens one, also done by Amazon, because it was very faithful to the book and it was nice and accurate. The master was good, it was done with obvious love and regard for the source material. They did cut out a bit, they did add a bit, but it made sense. And also, as I'm a person who's often very inspired by gaps in stories. That's where fiction and fan art comes in. I'm doing quite a lot of stuff for BBC Sherlock, where there are some building sites, I call them, where you need fan fiction to cope with things. And I've been a fan of the Good Omens book for many, many years. And when I watched the show, I thought, yeah, I could do fan art or something, but there is no need. I'm happy with what's presented. The same thing happened when I watched the Peter Jackson films, and my favorite character, Faramir, was completely butchered. And that was one of my most creative phases. I had 1 year of producing as much art as I hadn't done for years, because it was so wrong for me, and I felt I had to put it right. So yeah, it's
So you need the Amazon TV series to be awful, so you become really productive.
And that's one thing. Either it should be really bad, or so good that I will sit back and say, yeah, that's cool.
I'm going to turn to Marcel now, because you mentioned about the interests of fans are quite diverse. And Dimitra, you mentioned earlier about how the telling of the story evolves over time. So I guess there's been a lot of speculation online about diversity, particularly in casting decisions. What do you think about that, Marcel? Is that the right approach to take?
I think that, I mean, obviously The Lord of the Rings came out in 54, 55, and we've passed a couple of years since then. So I think that retelling or adapting a story like The Lord of the Rings, which is so beloved and so appreciated, it should also be a new way, a new diverse way, because if you have the opportunity of doing that, and I'm not going into, I know what the professor would have thought or said if he were with us, because that's absurd.
You would be fast, according to Brian.
Well, Brian said, but no, I think that there is because Tolkien used this gap technique, which I wrote an article about that on my blog, because he just leaves those gaps. He just hints at things. He names a name here, a little place there, and something that happened there, or a ruin, and you always know that's where creativity can come in, and that's what Brian said. So I'm sorry, about the creative freedom, which is fantastic. So you need to come up with new ideas, and there's nothing wrong inherently or bad or anything about it. It actually gives you more opportunities to show a completely different way of making things. And Versailles, it could be. I'm just still thinking about Sauron running around, looking swish, and all those people running after him and going.
So we talked about the Second Age and stories they can tell, and what we might like from the visuals and the opportunities that they've got, and potentially how they may embrace a bit more diversity as well. And I guess I want to come to the audience, because I bet there's going to be some cracking questions out there. But so I want to go to each person on the panel. We talked about kind of what we would like to see to make it a success. What would define it as a failure? And I know obviously in commercial terms, that was going to be fairly obvious, but in wider sort of narrative terms, in terms of Tolkien, what do we think would make this a failure? And we're looking to you, Brian, first. It is meant to be a tough question, yes.
This is a tough question. I think what would make it a failure is if at the end of it, people said that they weren't interested at all. And I think the use of the title, just coming back to that for a moment, which we talked about earlier, actually I can see exactly now why they use the title, because if you think of other, sorry Shaun, I'm not quite answering the question, but if you, I may work my way towards it, if you look at the other film franchises that we've been talking about, the unmentionable, and also, but think also of Harry Potter, think of Jackson's films. By the time these projects went into production, vastly different time scale between Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, but by the time those productions were being got underway, everybody had heard of the product. They knew what this franchise was. They hadn't read it. Many people didn't read Harry Potter. Many, many people I know who went to see Lord of the Rings to begin with had not read the book. Some people went on to read it. That's the way it works. But those franchises, it's also true of the Narnia series, which of course is being rebooted again now. So I think that what is the problematic here, and it's why the Lord of the Rings is such an important title, is because this stuff, this appendices, and all the other books that, you know, the history books that Christopher edited, are not, let's face it, they are not known to zillions of people. There aren't people sitting out there waiting and saying, I want to know what it says in the Tale of the Years. They're not there. So by using the Lord of the Rings, you are tying it into something that they either know as a book that they care about and are aware that there is the back history and so on. I know people who've never read the appendices to the book, and why should they if they don't want to? You know, as I'll probably say in my talk tomorrow, I got hooked up on reading this book because of the prologue, which was hard enough. So I know people who've never touched the appendices, and let alone all the other history books and documents that have been published. So, you know, some people are going to get stuck on the fact that it's the Lord of the Rings, and maybe it isn't the Lord of the Rings that they thought it was. I think it's a real problem.
So is the risk here then that audiences just don't find this as interesting a story?
There isn't a ready-made audience for this material, other than, yeah, the ready-made audience is for something else, something they've seen already in a different form. And it seems to me that's the stumbling block. So they have to get over it. I'm not saying they can't get over it. And I love the idea of a really sexy, swishy Sauron, because I can see it, I can see that kind of manipulative character, and how he could be so powerful and leading towards corruption. It's a very exciting.
Excellent. Dimitra,
failure. I think being too similar. I'm going to be completely different here, because I think it'll be too same, okay. Too similar to the previous, to what's come before, too many references, too many resonances. And there's a balance to strike here, because there have to be some elements that will be recognizable, not just the story, but even, you know, again, in adaptation theory, we talk about chains of transmission of the text, and there are elements that, for example, Peter Jackson used in the film that came from the Backstreet films. Yeah. And there are tiny little hints to, again, bring a different audience there. So there will have to be a balance there, but it can go very easily a predictable way, and that, I think, would be problematic.
There's no Legolas, is there?
Anke?
Yeah, I think it's the same for me, not just in terms of copying stuff from other fantasy adaptations, but also using certain elements of telling stories that are in fashion right now. The way characters are constructed. Right now I can think of certain shock effects. You've seen them so often that they are not shocking anymore. The way a scene is filmed, and music and lighting, and you know exactly what's going to happen, but that's not the purpose of it. The purpose is, it's supposed to be surprising, but it isn't. Same thing happened in The Two Towers when Aragorn went over the cliff. Gandalf had done that before. You've seen it in thousands of films, you know he will be back, because that's how these stories work. And this is one of my great fears, that they will stick to these Hollywood traditions, the way Hollywood tells stories.
Okay.
And I would love to see something a bit more daring, a bit more fresher, and not as easy to consume, maybe.
Jeremy?
So, I think a personal failure for me, this might be a critical success for making money, but they build this as the next Game of Thrones. And I think if they went with that, everything is gray, and there's no good and bad, and everybody goes back and forth, I think that kind of breaks the tone of Tolkien's world. And I don't think they have to go black and white. I think I'm very interested in them playing the characters that sit in that line, but not to the same extent that they've done with Game of Thrones. I'd be very concerned.
Marcel?
I think we should be talking about the elephant in the room, because I think Tom Shippey isn't here, right? So Tom has mentioned in part of the century that to him the most successful literary mode of the 20th century is the fantastic. And now it's the 21st century, and we're seeing so many fantasy series coming up. I mean, Ted Williams has been sold. I think HBO has 3 fantasy series coming up. And there are so many David Gamble innings. All of them are right now. Shannara has been tried and has failed. So what basically is happening is this is the most successful television mode that we're actually using. It's the fantasy and it's the science fiction stories. So it's basically, I think that's across the board with this panel is don't do the whole bloody fantasy thing like everyone else. Stick to, and if you want to look for messages in Lord of the Rings and why has this universal appeal is about even things like this fellowship and friendship and how this all works out and all the underlying notions that Tolkien has in his book, because they are effectively different from what the other writers have done. He is unique in what he's written. So if they can encapsulate that in a tiny way in those series, they are going to last much longer than just 7 series.
Okay, well let's take some questions from the audience. There are lots of hands already. I think Luke was first.
So really my question is a little bit about how, if you think that the fan culture that already exists around Tolkien will then influence Amazon. So for instance, we have repositories of fanfic, we have scholars and fans who have already made their own adaptations. I understand you're Amazon, you're paying writers, but do you also look at those resources and see if there's anything there that you can take and adapt?
What's answer that?
I think it's they can't. You hear of many authors who say, I'd love to read fan fiction, I can't, because if there's anything in there that shows up in, perhaps in 10 years I write a sequel to one of my novels, and there's anything in there that somebody else has mentioned in the fanfic, you get into real legal trouble. So I think they must, for their own safety, they must stay away from all of this and do something new, because otherwise there will be lots and lots and lots of claims for money, because somebody said, I have done this before, now you pay me.
Okay. One of the staff writers has this in a Twitter biography saying, I know that you love Tolkien, but if you solicit me any manuscripts, I'm going to have to block you because we cannot accept anything.
Yeah.
And
we've got quite a lot of questions, so Maggie next, who's going to ask a really quick yes or no question.
A quick one, possibly for Shaun, possibly for Brian, possibly for both of you. Bearing in mind that the Tolkien estate has said that they are only allowed to use the appendices material, they therefore can't go back to the original source of all the other books that lead up to that. How are they going to have enough material without making stuff up? Or without going back to earlier stuff, and then the Tolkien is going to say, you can't use that, that's in Lisbon variant, or whatever.
If I can answer it, because I actually haven't answered the question yet, but I think the simple solution is they are just going to make stuff up. I think that is it, that is what they will do.
What Shaun said.
David next. Sorry. David at the front and then Anna over here.
Thank you, greetings. Romero del Toro was going to originally direct The Hobbit, who has, you were talking about the style and storytelling. If he had done that, it would have been quite different from, thank you, nodding. So, my question is, who would you like to be seeing direct this Amazon version?
Who wants to answer that then? Oh, Anke.
Personally, for me, it would be Peter Ware because he did such a brilliant job on Master and Commander.
Okay.
Sorry, I'd give Del Toro a good go at it.
Anna.
About 4 or 5 years ago at Oxenmoot, we had a panel discussion about whether Jackson's films are a suitable legacy for Tolkien. And at that time, the answer was, it need not be the only one. Now it's not the only one, and what is your response?
I don't think this is going to be the end. I think there's going to be more, and we don't know. Okay, so at this point we know which bits of the work are up for grabs, but as things change and as things evolve and as copyright starts coming, getting to their end point, there will be more. I think this is going to be another phase of the legacy, but the legacy will continue in different forms.
Can I want to answer all 3 questions very briefly.
Oh.
All the same.
Sure,
I want there to be continuing stories forever. I think Tolkien would have been okay with that in time. I think he would nitpick on everything, but I think it would be wonderful, and I'm looking forward to when copyright expires and the whole world opens up, but I'm very happy to wait, and I want the texts themselves to remain sacrosanct, to be it. I want a
as they always do.
Yeah.
Everybody fears this, but every book that's been adapted always survives and endures whatever atrocities have been worked on. And I'm not saying any have, but you know what I mean.
And I greatly fear writing by committee, by pulling pieces in from hundreds of people. I want someone to own this and to have the vision, and I might like it or hate it, but I know that in 5 or 10 years this property is so strong, someone else's vision will come along and supplant it. So.
Okay. Right, we're going to take Shaun here, and then we'll go to Jessica, and then Joel, and I think we'll have to close it after that.
Thanks, Shaun. So this question is for anyone on the panel who wants to answer it, but I think it was Anke and Brian who both mentioned earlier, finding a connection point for the mainstream audience, someone for them to care about, since those who aren't maybe as familiar with the Second Age. One of the things I've been wondering is if they might use a Third Age character, possibly but not necessarily young Aragorn, as a character to be learning stories of the Second Age and use that as sort of a frame narrative for the Second Age stories. I'm curious, thoughts on possible advantages or risks with an approach like that?
Yeah, funny enough, I've wondered whether Gandalf might slip into these stories. Does anybody? Do you want to have a pop at this one? Anke says yes.
Yeah, I think it might work to have a bookends or like a framework for the story, and then going back and forth. The other side would be maybe have a character that's not mentioned in any of the texts. For example, a character living in Middle-earth, and then seeing the Numenorians arrive and seeing them from their point of view. So audience has somebody, or maybe a whole family or something to identify with, and then get introduced to all the other characters coming from afar, being there and being slightly different because they're elves or whatever. That might work as well as a framework.
Yeah, I mean, we've not really talked too much about characters specifically, but one of the things I think we all accept is there will be a lot of character invention to these stories. But
the device of historicity you were just touching on, I think is one of the strongest devices that they could use. It would have to be used really well, but I think it is a way into what is material which is not that perhaps widely known, but you've got a familiar guide to take you in. Yeah, I would favour that as a way in.
Okay, Jessica, quick question.
Yes, just adding to what Maggie said, the really detailed story of Numenor is in Unfinished Tales, Aldarian and Avengers, so they can't use that. And the details of
Do you know what they can and can't use?
I believe they can't use Unfinished Tales, they can't use the Silmarillion.
Have you seen the contract?
I believe they can't use the Silmarillion. Can they use the whole of the Akalabeth, which is inside the Silmarillion?
Is anybody here signatory on the contract? We don't know.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't know how much we're going to know about this until these things start being released. That's the honest answer.
Yes, but if it is to be like Game of Thrones, then it will be so sexed up and Ryan. Well,
I'm not detecting a question. If we can go to Joel now for the final finale question. It's going to be the best question we've had, Joel. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be huge applause.
Who's your favourite character? No. Just on that, I personally think Amazon, they're so big and huge, they can use whatever they like and get everything. But my question is, how do you reckon that the lukewarm at best reception to The Hobbit will be in some way an influence to this new series of what not to do?
I think they will have learned lessons from what's gone wrong, because there has been discussions, and Twitter nowadays is very influential. Some person on this panel got them to change things on a map, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So they are listening. They don't talk back. It's a black hole, but I know they're listening for one obvious thing. But
I guess that's sort of a point to conclude on, is how much are they going to be listening?
I think quite a lot.
Oh, they are, yeah, definitely.
I think so too. Well, thank you guys, thank all of you. I think it's been a really interesting